DeAnthony? DeAnthony? Good morning.
The battle lines are drawn, and once again, somebody's saying, wait, be patient. If they knew how long it would be before all people could truly hear freedom ring, I wonder which end of that moral arc would they choose. I wonder if more would have walked in his shoes. This is what revolution looks like. You gotta get in and then stay in this fight. You've got to find a way to get in the way. Speak out every day. Freedom riders, or let
and welcome to the Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute. We are so glad that you could join us this morning. And I am so happy that we have with us, of course, the incomparable, the expert as it relates to all things voting rights, Barbara Arnwine. And Barbara is going to introduce you to our guest lecturer today.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Good Trouble Institute. Oh my goodness, we have so much to talk about. What a week it has been nationally for voting rights. So when we are giving this presentation today, we are just feeding and enriching a very robust discussion that's already taking place. Oh, I am so honored today to introduce our featured guest lecturer. But before I do that, I always have to, thank everybody who made today's program possible. And thank you, Lynn, for getting us started, and Jessica Fortune Barker for doing all the logistics. And also, I gotta say a word to my mighty, mighty co-chair, my mighty co-leader, none other than Daryl D. Jones. Good morning, Daryl.
Good morning, Barbara. Wow, Saturday already, and I know we are powered up and ready to learn.
Yes, because we have the best. I've been tweeting about it all morning long and urging people to join us today. And we are so grateful for all of you who have joined us. I can see that we got people from all over the nation. So thank you for being here, because you're in for a treat. Gilda Ara Daniels. Oh my goodness. She serves as a professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. She is a nationally recognized voting rights and election law expert. She is a former deputy chief in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, voting section. Professor Daniels has more then 2 decades of litigation, negotiation, and consulting experience in the substantive voting rights area. She has investigated, negotiated, and litigated cases involving the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, and other voting statutes. She is the author of Uncounted: The Crisis of Voter Suppression in America, a book that Ms. Magazine called required reading. Star Booklet says that it provides a roadmap and a valuable resource for all participants in civic life. She is also the director of litigation for the Advancement Project's national office, which is a multiracial civil rights organization. She supervises attorneys in 4 program areas: power and democracy, voting rights, opportunity to learn, education, justice, policing and criminalization, and immigrant justice, immigration. She has drafted and participated in amicus briefs filed in the United States Supreme Court, frequently consults on voting rights issues, and is well published. Her scholarship focuses on the intersections of race, law, and democracy. And she has written a whole lot of what we call law review articles. And for those who aren't lawyers, those are major publications and journals of law schools that help lawyers to understand better the intellectual pillars of different cases, different trains of thought in the law. She is an amazing writer. She is someone who has been on TV, written, featured in the Washington Post, all things considered, all kinds of other places. And of course, you know, she's gotten awards. She clerked for Joseph W. Hatchett. If you don't know him, then you don't know an amazing leader who really made so many impacts on the 11th Circuit. She is a graduate of the New York University School of Law, where she was a Ruth Tilden Scholar, and Grambling State University. All right, now, she has a website that you can look her up on, www.gildadaniels.com, that promotes her scholarship and voter education. But you know what? I'm happy to introduce her because we used to work together. Because Gilda was one of those amazing lights at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law when I was there during my 25 years. And she was brilliant from the day that she walked in the office until, now she continues to just shine her light all over. And I am just honored and beyond belief happy and proud of one Gilda Daniels. To the world, to everybody watching, welcome our guest lecturer, the outstanding, amazing Gilda R. Daniels, Esquire. Hey, Gilda.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so happy to be here, and to the Transformative Justice Center and its fearless leader, the incomparable Barbara Arnwine. Certainly thank you for inviting me and allowing me to share today. And Dale Jones, I just found out, is an alum of UV.
That's right.
Power to the people.
There you go.
And Ms. Whitfield, thank you so much for essentially running me down and saying, okay, I need you to do this. And Barbara said so. So that's all I needed to know was that Barbara said so. So that's why I'm here. And I just, want to say, Barbara said we worked, that I worked with her. I worked for her. So I worked for Barbara Arnwine, and it was an incredible time in my career. One in which I remember certainly very fondly. It was actually the first time in my career that I had an African-American woman as my as my not supervisor, but certainly as a leader and a mentor. And so I looked up to Barbara, and the fact that she's doing this Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute just speaks to the many creative ways and certainly brilliant ways that she continues to develop to make sure that everybody understands, everybody gets the information, and that she doesn't hold this information up so that people can't reach it, but certainly makes sure that everybody can reach this information, and that it's not just for certain people, but that it's for all people, and that it is important. So thank you, Barbara, for your leadership, and thank you for this opportunity. Now, since I told you I work for Barbara and I work for Miss Whitfield today, because she told me you're going to talk about these things to continue the conversation that you have already started. Barbara mentioned all those, certainly the things I've certainly dedicated the majority of my career to voting rights, and not only litigating it, but also teaching it. So I've been a professor. I'm a full professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law. Been there for 15 years, and been teaching. One of the courses that I teach is election law, and so I continue to not only teach the students, but also speak across the country to explain to people certainly the importance of voting, because everybody thinks they know everything about voting because they actually vote, but there's so many things that go into this process, and certainly you all have been talking about certainly the right to vote, and there's this, and certainly how we get treated the right to vote in these United States of America. I understand that you all talked about voting rights and have gone through the Reconstruction Amendments, and I'm to go through to the Voting Rights Act up to around 2006. So that is what I have prepared to do, and certainly I'm willing to talk about whatever other issues you have or questions that you might have. So I think we can start with you all have been talking about the right to vote, and the right to vote, and believe it or not, there's this question about whether or not the right to vote is fundamental, but we certainly have a number of cases that certainly indicate that it is a fundamental right, but it is not always treated that way. We know that from the beginning of our country that we have this paradoxical democracy, where on the one hand we say all men are created equal, but then we also have a 3/5 compromise that treat enslaved persons as less than white persons, and that it would take about 100 years from the 3/5 compromise to the passage of the Civil War amendments, where you had the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, where the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. And as you learned certainly in your last lesson, that Black men were registering and electing on the state, local, and federal levels like we'd never seen before. Historians said that it was the first time in the history of the world that we saw a multiracial democracy. So in the late 1800s, was the first time that we saw a multiracial democracy in the world, and it was because of the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But in my book, I have a subsection that's entitled "Free at Last, Not So Fast," because while Black men were registering and electing on the state, local, and federal levels, those persons, certainly from the former Confederate states in particular, said free at last, not so fast. And so in order for them to come into the Union, they had to adopt the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Not only did they adopt the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but they also adopted, as you learned in your last class, literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and other measures that would prevent African-American men from registering to vote and certainly from holding office. And it was very, very effective. You see here the quote from South Carolina Senator Pitchfork Ben Tillman, which clearly state what the intent of the legislature was, not only the South Carolina legislature, but legislatures across the South, across the former Confederate states. Their intent was to remove Black men from the voter registration rolls, and they were very effective. As you see in Louisiana, in 1896, there were 135,000 Black men who were registered, but because of literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and violence, because violence was a big part of the push, certainly to remove Black men from the registration rolls. They could lose their land, lose their homes. They were burnt, their homes were and land were burned, and many people lost their lives for just attempting to register to vote, as well as to hold office. In my book, I talk about the massacre in Colfax, Louisiana. I'm from Louisiana, and my hometown is less than an hour from Colfax, Louisiana, where there was a massacre around the ability, certainly, of Black men to hold office. White men were put on a violent attack that essentially killed many people in order to regain power. So massacres, violence, threats, economic threats, economic terrorism, where people would lose their land, lose their jobs, and in some instances even lose their lives for voting Republican. Another part of the compromise, in regards to the compromise, when the states adopted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of the late 1890s removed federal protection. So they removed those Union troops from these former Confederate states. So I think we should also today pay attention to compromises, because it certainly was the Hayes-Tilden Compromise that removed the protection of the Union troops, and consequently led to allow certainly this widespread violence and this widespread taking of the right to vote. This extreme reduction in Black registration and Black participation in Louisiana is exemplary of other parts of the South as well. In Alabama, there were approximately 100,000 Black men who were registered in the 1890s, in around 1896. By 1906, that number had gone from 100,000 to 46 Black men who were registered to vote. So that number went down to less than 50 men from 100,000 in a very short period of time. We're talking about around 10 years, because of the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, removing protections around the ability for people to register and to cast a ballot, as well as these state constitutional conventions that implemented the literacy test, poll taxes, and other disenfranchising devices that Dr. King called conniving methods in his Give Us the Ballot speech in 1954, 1955. He said that all types of conniving methods were being used to keep the Negro away from the ballot box. And so we certainly saw that these methods were not prevented by the passage of these constitutional amendments, because we had the 14th Amendment, we had the 15th Amendment, and we've had the 19th Amendment, which we just celebrated 100 years of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920. And in my book, I used my grandmother, who was born in 1919. So she was born a year before the certainly the passage and authorization of the 19th Amendment. So she was born in 1919, yet she did not, she voted for, I'm sorry, she voted for the first time in the 1960s. So while you had the 15th Amendment, which says that you cannot certainly, which says that you cannot deny or abridge the right to vote. That's what RTV stands for, on account of race, color, or previous servitude. And you had the 19th Amendment, which essentially said that women were allowed to vote, that you could not discriminate based on sex. This in the South in particular, and even the parts of the North, they continued to prevent the ability of Black and brown people across the country to register and vote. As I said before, my grandmother, although she was born in 1919, she should have voted for the first time in the 1940s. Yet it would take another 20 years before she could register and cast a ballot, because she was a Black woman who lived in Louisiana. So while you have these constitutional amendments, they in many ways did not allow for the enfranchisement of Black and brown people. We saw in places like New York had a literacy test for persons from Puerto Rico, and they had that literacy test through the 1960s. That you actually had to pass the literacy test, and they gave you a card, a card that said that you had passed the literacy test and were allowed to vote. So those types of conniving methods that Dr. King talked about certainly continued with these state legislative, these state laws that in the face of these constitutional amendments continue to prevent Black and brown people from registering and voting. And yet there is a debate over whether the right to vote is even contained in the Constitution, and whether or not there's a need for an affirmative right to vote in the United States Constitution, because of, as you've seen, state legislature, certainly during after Reconstruction, which ended Reconstruction, certainly the ability to pass state laws that denied people the right to vote. So there's a debate that has certainly been going on for the last 10 years or so about whether or not there's a need for something more in the United States Constitution to prevent state legislatures from passing things like poll taxes and grandfather clauses, which essentially said that you could vote if your grandfather voted prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment, which was a way of certainly enabling that Black men could not register and could not vote. So that is an ongoing debate. But we have these constitutional amendments, and again, as Dr. King said, they certainly did not. They did not prevent these state laws that prohibited in many places, and certainly prevented or thwarted the ability of Black people and brown people from registering to vote. Because this is not only in the Deep South, but in the Southwest as well, places like Texas, where Latinx people were being prevented from registering and voting. I sent a version of the 1965, I'm sorry, the Alabama literacy test, which was in place certainly prior to 1965. Hopefully you had an opportunity to take that literacy test. It was an example of certainly what barriers stood between Black and brown voters and the ability to cast a ballot. There are people like Myrtle Pless Jones, who lived in Montgomery, Alabama. She was a graduate of South Carolina State University and had received her master's degree from Michigan State University, and she got married and moved and lived in Montgomery, Alabama with her husband and daughters. and she went to vote, went to register to vote in Montgomery, Alabama, and in the late 1950s. She went to vote in Montgomery, Alabama, and she was asked how many bubbles are in a bar of soap. This is a story that I have in my book, Uncounted, and she is the Mrs. Jones is the mother of one of my colleagues at the University of Baltimore, Cassandra Havard, and so she recounted this story of her mother, where she went to register to vote in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s, and she was asked how many bubbles are in a bar of soap. That was the literacy test. So she, instead of having to answer these questions in this Alabama literacy test that I provided, certainly were questions that were asked by some counties, and that was something to understand, certainly, that these various counties implemented various barriers to the ballot box. And so someone like Mrs. Jones, who had not only an undergraduate degree, but a graduate degree, so asking her the questions on that literacy test, often the person asking the questions had less education than the person than certainly than Mrs. Jones. She was asked how many bubbles in a bar of soap. She said around 100. She was told that answer was wrong and could not register to vote. So you had certainly see how literacy tests prevented certainly Black and brown people from registering to vote, which is a part of one of those conniving methods that Dr. King talked about. And so from Mrs. Jones's example, and certainly there are countless other examples, certainly during that time, it was clear that something more was needed in order for Black and brown people across the country to enjoy certainly these fundamental rights of citizenship, and that is the right to vote, and the ability to register and certainly cast a ballot was being thwarted across the South in particular, and became a place where folk began to notice, and a lot of it had to do, it certainly came to a crescendo, if you will, on Bloody Sunday. Certainly where former Congressman John Lewis and Reverend Hosea Williams led a group of marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and they were met by state troopers who beat them, and many of them were maimed and harmed and injured, but it was on display for the entire world to see. So when the world was watching and the world was able to see the brutality that African Americans faced just for attempting to register to vote, and certainly after years and decades of persons going to the executive, going to the United States president, going to the Congress, and saying we must have more. Right, more than the 15th Amendment, more than the 19th Amendment, more than the 14th Amendment, in order for us to participate. Seeing the inhumanity on Bloody Sunday led certainly President Lyndon Baines Johnson to say that we must pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it was certainly historic. And so he gave a speech before the Congress where he used the term, he said that we shall overcome. That was historic. Remember, Lyndon Baines Johnson was from Texas. So for him to be certainly a person from the South, and now championing certainly the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and seeing certainly Bloody Sunday as well as other events, certainly the deaths that occurred for people who were marching and were bringing awareness to certainly the inhumanity and the terrorism that was being enacted on Black people. Lyndon Baines Johnson said, "Freedom is not enough, and you do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying, now you are free to go where you want, do as you desire, and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a man who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race saying you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe you have been completely fair. It's not enough to open the gates of opportunity." And in August of that year, he passed the Voting Rights Act. He signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, we talked about certainly the brutality that was associated with certainly the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But for those of you who are data people, if you just look at this data in regards to the voter registration rates prior to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and you see the gaps, right? That in Mississippi, less than 10% of African Americans were actually registered to vote. But I saw in the video, you talked about Fannie Lou Hamer, right? So this is certainly what Fannie Lou Hamer was fighting for, was the ability to register, because less than 10% of Black people were registered in the state of Mississippi prior to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which was a 50% gap. In November of 1988, you see that the gap is certainly less than that. It's around 7.4%. If we zoom out to today, in many of these states, Black voters are in parity in regards to their registration rates. And so this is the registration rates, meaning that the rate of certainly the eligible Black persons who are eligible to register, this percentage of them are actually registered. So in 1965, 6.7% in Mississippi were of the persons who were of the appropriate age to register. Only 6.7 of them were registered. You see that number has increased to 74.2 in 1988. So they were in 1965, in March 1965, they were at a 6.7% rate because of economic terrorism. Fannie Lou Hamer talks about how she lost her land, right? And certainly she was also violently beaten, and others were killed, certainly in Mississippi and other places, for registering people to vote. And so that's why you have these registration numbers and the way they look in places like Louisiana. My grandmother, I asked my grandmother, why didn't she vote until after passage of the Voting Rights Act? She said Black people didn't vote, right? And Black people didn't vote, not because it wasn't because they didn't want to vote, it's because of all of these conniving methods that were in place to prevent the registration, as well as the ability to cast a ballot. So you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it is certainly considered as one of the most effective civil rights statutes enacted by Congress. It has some key provisions, which are Section 2, Section 5, Section 2, which is a national prohibition against discriminating based on race. And so you have Section 2, and I will talk more about Section 2. Section 5 was a temporary provision in the Voting Rights Act, which required certain jurisdictions, certain covered jurisdictions to get pre-approval of any voting changes. And we'll talk more about Section 5. And then Section 8 says that you can have the sister of your choice. And so then, because we saw in many places that people were being denied the person they wanted to assist them, whether it was someone who was younger than 18, they may have brought their child with them to help them read the ballot and to indicate how they wanted to vote. And so the Section 8 says that you can have the person you choose to assist you, with some small exceptions, like your employer or a union rep. Section 203 is the language provisions, which say that if you reach a certain threshold that the census determines, that if 5% of your if 5% of the persons in your jurisdiction speak English less than well or less than very well, then you are covered under Section 203. And Section 203 requires that you prevent whatever materials, election materials you print in English or provide in English, you must also provide them in the covered language. So many of you probably live in jurisdictions where you have materials, you receive materials that are in both English and in Spanish. Right, so that's what Section 203 is, certainly the language provision. Section 8 talks about assistance, and we'll talk more about Section 2 and Sections 2 and 5, which are the primary provisions within the Voting Rights Act. Okay. So we also wanted another point about the power of the Voting Rights Act. It's not only led to an increase in the voter registrations, but also in Black elected officials. And this chart only goes through 1992, but you see certainly can see the progressions. If you look here, this is around the time that you had the state constitutional conventions and certainly the removal of the Union troops. And you see from there to 1900, like Black elected officials are almost non-existent. And then from 1964, you see that it starts to go up higher. All right, and that's all because of the Voting Rights Act. We see that there was within the Voting Rights Act enforcement, they've been categorized as like first and second generations. First generation of Voting Rights Act enforcement really had to do with a focus on participation and certainly getting rid of things like literacy tests, poll taxes, violence, because voter intimidation was also included in the voting. Right. There's also prohibitions against voter intimidation. And then the second generation, which essentially is from the 1980s to 1990s, you see this focus on representation, where we're looking at how at-large elections impact the ability to participate, as well as redistricting practices, which is something that we certainly will see in these coming days and weeks and months. There have always been challenges to the Voting Rights Act, almost from its inception. We see the South Carolina versus Katzenbach case in 1966. Remember, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And so that case was filed almost immediately after it was signed into law, and it was challenged in South Carolina versus Katzenbach. Katzenbach was the Attorney General at the time, who actually asked Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act, and to give it so that he and certainly the Department of Justice would have more tools than the 14th and 15th Amendment to enforce the fundamental right to vote. In the South Carolina versus Katzenbach case, as well as these other cases, the Mudno case and the Shelby County case, which I know you'll talk about in coming weeks, what was the central part of the challenge was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which required covered jurisdictions to submit their changes to the either the Attorney General or the DC District Court. And so you see, there have always been challenges to the Voting Rights Act. It has been challenged certainly from its inception to today. So those challenges continue, and it has a whole lot to do with power, who's in power, and it has a whole lot to do with people making determinations about who they think should be eligible to vote. All right. So if we look at Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, as I said before, this is actually from the act, certainly from the act in section 5, it designated certain covered jurisdictions, and it had a triggering formula, which says that if you had any voting qualification or prerequisite to voting or standard practice or procedure with respect to voting, different from that in force or effect on November 1st, 1964, that you had to submit those changes to either the DC District Court or to the Attorney General of the United States. And I was a deputy chief in the Civil Rights Division voting section during the Clinton and Bush administrations. And we had an entire section of attorneys and all they did, and other staff who reviewed these changes. Any change, whether it was moving a polling place across the street or a congressional redistricting, had to be approved by the Attorney General for the United States or the DC District Court. And the Attorney General had 60 days to review, and if in those 60 days he had to determine whether or not it was whether or not it met the standard for Section 5. And this is one of the cases, certainly in 1969, as I said, there were many challenges. And so there's cases about what changes should be included. Essentially, any change that affected voting had to be pre-cleared. So any small precinct changes, any polling place changes, congressional redistrictings, changing the form of government, whether you move from an at-large to a districting system, had to be pre-cleared. This is another case, and I'll share this slide with the Institute, and the standard for changes was retrogression, right? And so in the Beer case, they made that clear, is that the standard is retrogression, meaning does the change put Blacks and other voters of color in a worse position, right? So if they were in a, for example, if you had one majority minority district and this jurisdiction submitted a plan that had 0, that would put voters in a worse position, and that would be objected to and would not go into effect. So the important thing about Section 5 is that these changes, whether it's polling places, redistrictings, and others, would not go into effect until they were pre-cleared or approved by the Attorney General. All right. This is a map of the covered jurisdictions. You see that some of them were covered for Section 5. The ones in green are those that are covered under Sections 5 and 203. So they not only had to include changes to practices or procedures and have those pre-cleared, they also had to provide all of their election materials in Spanish or whatever covered language, whatever the covered language was. This is a map from 2013, pre-Shelby County versus Holder, which is a case that you'll talk about in the coming weeks. But this is a pre-Shelby map, which shows you what jurisdictions are covered or were covered. Okay, there are also a number of fixes in the that were made under Section 5 that essentially continue to talk about what things would be covered for under the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and what of those changes would have to be pre-cleared. So the important thing to know about Section 5 was that any changes that affected voting had to be pre-cleared, and there are a number of cases as well as fixes that occurred. And so Section 5 was very important, and jurisdictions, the Department of Justice would receive tens of thousands of submissions every year, which and they would have to be pre-cleared before they would be implemented. And certainly during redistricting years, that number would go up tremendously. But all of those could not be implemented until they were pre-cleared. Another provision of the Voting Rights Act, primary provision of the Voting Rights Act is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. There were amendments to this Voting Rights Act in order to clarify and also meant to, in many ways, expand the reach of the Voting Rights Act. And so you see here, you can compare the statute with the United States Constitution and see that the Voting Rights Act in many ways mirrors the 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And this was one of the amendments that was made in 1982 after the Mobile versus Bolden case, which essentially said that you had to prove intent. The case essentially said you had to prove intent in these voting rights cases. And then Congress made amendments to that, which essentially said that if it results in discrimination, then it would be a violation of the Voting Rights Act. Okay. So these are certainly the changes to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. I'm looking at my time, and this is just the statute itself, which essentially said is a nationwide prohibition against discrimination. So while Section 5 said that only certain jurisdictions had to make their changes available to the Attorney General for pre-clearance or for approval, Section 2 said that any changes that discriminated could be challenged under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So Section 2 was nationwide. Section 5 only covered a few states, which looked very much like the former Confederate states. The important thing about the Voting Rights Act was Section 5 provisions. The Section 5 provision was one that's considered a temporary provision and had to be reauthorized by Congress. You see President Reagan's statement before he signed a reauthorization in 1982. And you note that 1982 was also when they made a change in regards to the Voting Rights Act in Section 2. But Section 5, with his reauthorization in 1982, he said, we'll reauthorize the use of Section 5 for another 25 years. And you saw that the Congress in 1982 did indeed reauthorize Section 2. And this last picture is one of John Roberts, who worked with President Reagan at in 1982, who is now Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and is certainly has been one of the chief writers on some of these very important voting rights cases. And he has not necessarily been a friend. He wasn't a friend of the Voting Rights Act in 1982 when he worked for Ronald Reagan, and is not necessarily a friend of the Voting Rights Act today. This is probably the key case in regards to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is Thornburg versus Jingles, which has some technical requirements in regards to determining whether or not there's been a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and looking at these three prerequisites: whether or not a minority group is politically cohesive, whether or not whites vote as a bloc to defeat minority preferred candidates, and whether or not the minority group is sufficiently large and geographically compact, so essentially so that they can actually have at least one single member district. And the second part of the Voting Rights Act says, let's look at the totality of the circumstances. Let's look at some of the other things that go into play in regards to voting, whether or not we have racially polarized voting, whether or not we have a history of discrimination in education or housing and other areas. It's one of the things I enjoy about certainly voting rights cases is that we look at that we don't just look at the numbers, who was elected. We look at certainly we put the case in context, what kinds of official discrimination existed in the state or the jurisdiction. So these are also considerations that the court has to make in determining whether or not there's a violation of Section 2. So Section 2 and certainly Section 5 have endured since the 1965 passage of the Voting Rights Act. And we had another reauthorization in 2006, which was the Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, and Coretta Scott King Voting Rights Act, which extended Section 5 for another 25 years. And then also had another fix in the that was a result of a case called Georgia versus Ashcroft, and some other fixes in that vein. I'm rushing because I'm running out of time here, but here are the differences between Section 5 and Section 2. And so you see the importance of both of them, and that Section 5 is preemptive. It's before the standard is implemented, and Section 2 is nationwide. The legislation says this is the law, and then you can using Section 2 to challenge the law. You see that in Georgia as well as in Florida today and other places across the country. And you're not seeing Section 5 because that essentially has been gutted and removed, and that's again what you will learn about in the coming weeks. One of the things that we want you to, I think Ms. Whitfield told me I had to give you some homework, and so if you're looking at, you saw that 2006 it was reauthorized, and that now the Congress has certainly passed legislation that can impact the Voting Rights Act. So we saw there was a Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2019, and there's also, it's now being called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and it was still HR 4. And so it's your homework is certainly to compare certainly this Voting Rights Advancement Act with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to see what changes that may exist, because it's an effort to strengthen the Voting Rights Act and certainly bring it back to its, certainly to provide more tools, just as Katzenbach asked for in 1960. Certainly we see Merrick Garland saying the same thing today. We need more tools in order to fight this battle, because again, the 14th and 15th Amendments and other amendments that impact voting are not enough to stop these state legislatures from passing these conniving methods that prevent the participation of people of color in the voting process. That's all I have. I know that's a lot, but you certainly, hopefully, you've seen certainly the impact of the Voting Rights Act, why it was needed, what adjustments have been made, as well as bringing you up through 2006, and certainly understanding where certainly at that point, certainly the reauthorization process, as well as the impact that the Voting Rights Act continues to have on us today. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Daniels. Just excellent. I know that the Barbara and Lynn wanted to jump in, and I tell you, one of the interesting things when we do this analysis of voting rights in the United States, now I usually push a pin, right? And on April the 3rd, 1964, because on April the 3rd, 1964 was the time that we talk about this Black nationalist philosophy that was developed and was presented, and it came by way of one Malcolm X, who delivered his speech on ballot or the bullet. And and that was in Cleveland, Ohio, when this is being presented. And we're talking, it's at the King Solomon's Baptist Church where this is being presented. And we're at a point in American history in dealing with voting rights where, as you've indicated, that there were a lot of advancements that had been made during that first Reconstruction, and then they were taken away violently in many areas. And then there tried to be some advancement that was trying to be made to reassure and push Blacks back into, and Blacks and Browns back into the position of voting. And what we find from April the 3rd, 64, and in my estimation, is applicable even today, coming from Malcolm X.
Absolutely.
And that is, when Malcolm X spoke at that point, he was really advocating Blacks being judicious in the exercise of the right to vote. Go use the right to vote to change the community. And that is the philosophy that he was coming with on April the 3rd, 64. And it was really interesting because you then began to see a lot of suppressive techniques being used to try to keep that Black vote down, to keep him from being so incredibly articulate, so particularly and received so well by the community. And the interesting part, I think, Professor, is that when I start thinking about this Ballad of the Bullet speech, and I'm thinking about one of the lines there where he says, I'm not going to sit at your table and watch you eat with nothing on my plate and call myself a diner. Okay, sitting at the table doesn't make you a diner unless you eat some of what's on the plate. Right. And that's pretty much where we are. And I do this analysis. I say, that's back where we are today. That's back where we are today. They want to have Blacks come out and vote, but Blacks and Brown come out and vote in numbers. But when it came time to push for the Voting Rights Act, when it came time to push for the People Act, where are we? They're putting us behind infrastructure. They're putting us behind. So they want us to put them first and then to put us last, and we get put last. That's a large part of what I think Malcolm X was pushing for, right, for the Black community, and saying, we've got to be certain to use our vote. We've got to be certain to register to vote. We've got to be certain that our agenda is at the front of what's being addressed. That's a large part, I think, of what I hear happening. And what I saw happening and when you in your presentation was a large part of that, right? Because during that first Reconstruction, you started putting that Black agenda first, putting Blacks in place, and then you had the response of that pushback from that to stop, and all the violence that then flowed from that to stop Blacks from voting. The chart that you displayed, I thought, was just incredibly telling, to show the numbers of Blacks that were registered in '88, the numbers of Blacks that were registered prior to that. And it coincides, interestingly, particularly, Barbara, I think, with a part of when Reverend Jackson was running for president, right? Yes. 84 and 88. You see, they had the reason to get registered, they had the reason to get in, they had the reason to be involved. So that was just really a powerful chart that I thought accurately displayed what was going on at that point in American history. So I really appreciate the presentation that you've done for us today at this institute. We got a lot out of it, learned a lot about it. And, and Barbara knows me, and I'm a big fan of Malcolm X. And I tell you that, he's talking about the Ballad of the Bullet and fighting the white man's oppression. And I say today, that's right where we are. We're right back in this battle, fighting this oppression. That's where we are. So I truly appreciate all that you laid out, and certainly encourage everyone who's viewing this to go get a copy of Uncounted by Gilda Daniels and read it. It's the crisis of voter suppression in America. Barbara, I kick it back over to you.
Yes, and thank you again, Gilda. That was fabulous. Thank you for really letting people know about the debate that's going on about the right to vote. That's really important right now. There's a lot, in our community that's happening. And thank you for, giving people the background and giving, an overview of the fight, and how the 65 Act, came to be, and all of its important provisions, and the fight, that Shelby gave us in 2013. I wanted to also, Daryl, you spoke about the Ballad on the Bullet, the other speech that people need to read. I think you got to read both of these speeches and juxtapose them against each other because they're both so relevant even today. But there was a meeting at which Dr. King and several other quote, prominent civil rights leader spoke in 1957. And that is where Dr. King gave the speech called Give Us the Ballot. And you got to read the Give Us the Ballot speech, because Malcolm X did his ballot on the bullet based on that speech. It was a response, an updated response, almost a decade later to that speech. And when you read both of the speeches, you really can see the thought that still permeates, our fight for voting rights. And it's just so much good learning. And I hope that people will take the time to read Dr. King's Give Us the Ballot, and to read Malcolm X's The Ballot on the Bullet, because what he says is that if you don't want us to have the ballot, then get prepared for the bullet. That's what he says. And he says the bullet can mean many different things. And it is a powerful speech, because if you lived in that era, and I was a little, I was a girl during that time, but if you lived in that era, you will know that that speech shook up Black America. It was like, I can't even begin to tell you the impact it had. When people talk about the way, how cataclysmic it was when Barack Obama was elected, that speech had the same impact. People were talking about it on every corner. People were, every household. It was the dominant barbershop, beauty shop conversation. Because remember, at that time, the Black Muslims did not vote. And so for his to come out and to really speak so powerfully about voting just was an absolutely game-changing, paradigm-shifting moment. So I really encourage you, Daryl, I want to encourage you to look at those two speeches. We'll pick them up, more in the days to come. Also, do look at the Nation article that I wrote with John Nichols. It's in The Nation magazine article from May from 2018, and you will see that we titled it, Dr. Martin Luther King's call to give us the ballot is as relevant today as it was in 1957. Read it. And when Daryl was talking about all the gamesmanship around these pending voting rights bills, you'll see the same issues in King's speech. When he talks about the both sidism, watch him. You got to read where he talks about the moderate stance, about the, you just got to read it. That's all I can say. And Betty, thank you so much, Betty Magnus, for putting into the chat so much about about Jesse Jackson's run for president. And that's been, beautifully, talked about. So we will, continue this series. Gilda, you are magnificent. Everybody's saying they're getting your book. So I'm sure that we'll be talking about the book next session. We'll be waving our books and talking about it. And thank you to your mom for her fight. And thank you for everything that you do to advance justice and keep doing the great work, because we need, and we're proud of our litigators. We're proud of the victory that happened just this week, this past week in North Carolina, where, the state threw out their felon disenfranchisement law. That didn't just happen, y'all, because somebody woke up and said, wouldn't that be a nice thing? These litigators got in there and did this battle over the years, not in many, many years. So I want to just thank people. They threw, they were able to, continue that fight over the voter ID law in North Carolina. There's so much going on everywhere you look. So thank you for your work. Thank you for the advancement projects, beautiful work. And thank you for your public education. We are so grateful that you joined us this Saturday morning. Thanks to everybody who's listened. And so we turn it back over to you, Lynn, to take us home. And Daryl, we can't wait for next week.
There we go.
All right now,
Yes,
we got a lot to say.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. Before you leave, we do have one last thing we have to do. Ms. Daniels, thank you for allowing me to hunt you down and for giving us a call to action. But there are other calls to actions also. If you received a reminder for this meeting from Zoom, the bottom of that had the link for the 1965 Alabama literacy test. If you have not already done that, please go to that link and look at that and take that test. Give yourself only 5 minutes and let's see how well you do. I'm going to tell you, I got a JD and I was still stumped by some of those questions they were asking, but do that. The other calls to action for today are here. Contact your Senate or representatives and tell them to pass the Freedom to Vote Act now.
And stop for 1 minute there, Lynn. How do people contact them? There is a congressional switchboard, everybody. And that number is 202-224-3121. 202-224-3121. And you can just call it and they will put you in touch with your senator.
Thank you, Barbara. The next is, I want you to take your hand at drafting an op-ed article for your local paper, explaining why voting is so important. It's not something, you don't have to submit it, but just take your hand at writing one and putting your thoughts down on paper. And then share with 5 friends what you have learned today about the Voting Rights Act, and encourage them to watch the replay and to register for the Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute. Now, another way you can help us at TJC is going back to our webpage. This is free. We offer all this information free, but if you feel a desire to donate to TJC, you can go to our website, tjcoalition.org, and donate there. To post your responses to the call to action, go to our Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute Facebook group page, and you will be able to join after you answer the questions in the affirmative. And we want to thank you for being with us today. And I want you to hear, this is the book, of course, Uncounted. Everyone, it is our suggested reading for this week. Please read it, buy it. It is available on Amazon. And again, thank you, Ms. Daniels, for all your knowledge you poured into us today. Now let's hear from one of our leaders of tomorrow.
Hi, my name is Fatou Kalix. I'm a current 2L at Florida State University, and I am all about voting. The reason I came to law school was because I thought it was important to have representation and equal representation and have someone that looks like me. And for me, it is important that we as minorities, as Black people in this country, come together and vote for the representation that we would like. And that is what I'm trying to do post-graduation. I'm trying to vote, have people register to vote, turn out voters, and it's what I'm doing currently as a law student because I feel that is what we need right now. Our democracy is on the line. Let's vote.
Thank you. Class is dismissed. See you next week. And we will be talking about the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and how it was gutted. Thank you again for joining us.